I moved into Meadowbrook Estates on a crisp October morning, thrilled to finally own my dream home. The neighborhood was pristine, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained properties that spoke of community pride. What I didn't know was that our Homeowners Association president, Karen Whitmore, viewed the neighborhood less as a community and more as her personal fiefdom. I'm an aviation safety consultant who travels frequently for work, which means I'm away about 2 weeks out of every month conducting audits for airlines and regulatory agencies. It's demanding work, but it pays exceptionally well, and over the years, I've built relationships with everyone from airline executives to Federal Aviation Administration officials to airport authority directors. Those connections were about to become very useful. My first encounter with Karen happened during my second week in the neighborhood. I'd just returned from a trip to find a neon orange violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox. According to the notice, my garbage bins had been visible from the street on a non-collection day, which violated Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws. I checked my security camera footage and confirmed what I suspected. The bins had been out for exactly 45 minutes while I transferred bags from my garage. Annoyed but wanting to be a good neighbor, I went to that month's HOA meeting to introduce myself and politely contest the $50 fine. If you're enjoying this story of HOA overreach, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more tales of petty tyrants getting exactly what they deserve. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this is headed. Karen sat at the head of the community center table like a queen holding court, her highlighted hair sprayed into an immovable helmet, her pursed lips ready to dispense judgment. When I explained the situation and asked for the fine to be waived given the brevity of the violation, she didn't even look up from her papers. The rules exist for everyone, not just when it's convenient for you. The fine stands. Next item. I paid the $50, chalking it up to an overzealous volunteer, and resolved to be more careful. That resolution lasted exactly as long as it took Karen to find her next target, which unfortunately was still me. Over the following months, I received violation notices for increasingly absurd infractions. My car was parked 3 inches over the edge of my driveway apron. My porch light was apparently 0.2 lumens brighter than the maximum allowed for ambient lighting. The decorative shutters on my home were listed as colonial blue in the architectural approval documents, but Karen insisted they were actually colonial navy, an unauthorized color. Each violation came with a fine, each contest was denied with the same dismissive response from Karen, and each interaction left me more frustrated than the last. I was traveling too much to engage in a prolonged dispute, so I paid the fines and tried to stay off her radar. Then came the incident that changed everything. I was returning from a particularly exhausting trip, a week-long audit of an airline's maintenance procedures that had involved 12-hour days and multiple facility inspections. I'd barely slept on the red-eye flight home and was looking forward to collapsing into my own bed. As I pulled my rolling suitcase up my driveway at 6:30 in the morning, Karen appeared from nowhere, marching across her lawn with her phone held up like a weapon. "Excuse me. Excuse me. You're in violation of the noise ordinance. It's before 7 a.m., and you're creating a disturbance." I stared at her, genuinely confused about what disturbance she could possibly mean. My suitcase wheels on my own driveway? Karen, I'm just coming home from a work trip. I'm not making any unusual noise. She stepped closer, her face flushed with the thrill of catching someone in violation. The sound of your suitcase wheels violates the community quiet hours, which extend until 7 a.m. That's a $100 fine. And your car alarm chirped when you locked it. That's another $100 for unnecessary noise. I was too tired to argue, so I simply went inside and added this to my growing list of Karen grievances. But Karen wasn't finished with me. Over the next 2 months, she began what I can only describe as a harassment campaign. She filed complaints about my lawn being a 1/4 inch too tall, even though I used the same lawn service as half the neighborhood. She reported me for having a package visible on my porch for more than 24 hours, even though I'd been out of town and couldn't retrieve it. She sent formal letters threatening legal action because my house numbers were apparently installed half an inch lower than the HOA specification required. The fines accumulated into the thousands, and each time I tried to address her concerns reasonably, she became more aggressive and dismissive. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. I was scheduled to fly out early the next morning for a meeting with the airport authority in a major hub city, a meeting that had taken months to arrange and was crucial for renewing a significant consulting contract. My flight was at 6 a.m., which meant leaving my house by 4:30. At 9 p.m., the night before my flight, my doorbell rang. It was Karen, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members who looked deeply uncomfortable. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations and your attitude toward community standards," Karen announced, pushing past me into my foyer without invitation. For the next hour, Karen lectured me about community values and respect for rules while I repeatedly tried to explain that I needed to prepare for an early flight. She dismissed every attempt I made to end the conversation, insisting that my travel schedule didn't excuse me from my responsibilities to the neighborhood. When I finally told her firmly that she needed to leave, she smiled that particular smile of someone who'd been waiting for you to step out of line. "That's harassment. You're being threatening and aggressive. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the board, and we're going to start eviction proceedings." The other board members actually objected, pointing out that I'd done nothing wrong, but Karen silenced them with a glare. I barely slept that night, partly from anger and partly from worry that I'd miss my alarm. I made it to the airport with 30 minutes to spare before boarding, checked in at the kiosk, and headed through security. I was finally starting to decompress as I reached my gate when I saw her. Karen was standing near the boarding area, talking on her phone with animated gestures. My heart sank as I realized we were on the same flight. I considered my options and decided the mature thing to do was simply avoid her, take my seat, and ignore her for the duration of the 2-hour flight. Boarding began, and I settled into my aisle seat in the economy comfort section, grateful I'd have a bit more legroom for the early morning flight. The cabin filled steadily, and then I heard her voice, loud and already complaining. "This seat is unacceptable. I specifically requested a window seat. This is absolutely incompetent service." I glanced up to see Karen blocking the aisle, berating a flight attendant, while passengers backed up behind her. The flight attendant, a young woman whose name tag read Jessica, was maintaining admirable composure. "Ma'am, according to our system, you're checked in for the middle seat in this row. I'd be happy to see if there are any window seats available once everyone is boarded." Karen's face reddened. "I am not sitting in a middle seat. Do you know who I am? I fly this airline constantly. This is unacceptable." Jessica patiently explained that the flight was completely full and that Karen would need to take her assigned seat so boarding could continue. That's when Karen noticed me sitting 2 rows ahead. Her eyes lit up with recognition and something darker. Of course he's on this flight. He probably sabotaged my seat assignment. He's been harassing me for months." I kept my eyes forward, refusing to engage, but I could feel every passenger's attention turning toward the unfolding drama. Jessica tried to redirect Karen's attention. "Ma'am, I assure you that passenger seat assignments are randomized and no other passenger has access to your reservation. Please take your seat." But Karen was on a roll now, empowered by her perceived authority and an audience. "You don't understand. That man is dangerous. He's been threatening me. He has anger issues. I don't feel safe with him on this flight." My stomach dropped. This was crossing a line from neighborhood pettiness into something that could have serious consequences. I caught Jessica's eye and shook my head slightly, trying to convey that I wasn't a threat, but Karen's voice was rising to a near shriek. "I am telling you that I feel unsafe. If he's on this flight, I'm not flying. You need to remove him immediately." The entire cabin had gone silent. Every passenger was watching this spectacle, and I could see people starting to record on their phones. Another flight attendant approached, an older man whose name tag identified him as Marcus, clearly the senior crew member. He spoke in the calm, authoritative tone of someone who dealt with difficult passengers for decades. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and take your assigned seat, or we'll need to ask you to deplane." Karen whirled on him, her finger jabbing the air. Are you threatening me? I am a paying customer, and I'm reporting a legitimate safety concern. Marcus remained calm but firm. Ma'am, making false accusations against another passenger is a serious matter. I've been watching this situation, and the gentleman you're accusing hasn't engaged with you at all. Now you can take your seat, or you can deplane voluntarily. Those are your options. For a moment, I thought Karen might actually back down. Her mouth opened and closed, her face cycling through shades of red. Then she made the worst possible decision. She lunged forward, trying to push past Marcus toward me, screaming, "You're all incompetent. That man is a threat, and you're doing nothing." What happened next occurred in rapid succession. Marcus and Jessica physically blocked Karen from advancing down the aisle. Karen began screaming that she was being assaulted. The captain emerged from the cockpit, took one look at the situation, and made a call on his radio. Within 90 seconds, airport security was boarding the aircraft. Karen's screaming intensified as she realized what was happening, her accusations growing more wild and desperate. "He threatened to kill me. He's been stalking me. You're letting a dangerous man fly." The security officers were professional but firm, taking Karen by each arm and escorting her off the aircraft while she continued to scream accusations and threats. The cabin remained silent for a long moment after she was removed. Then Marcus made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for that disruption. We're going to need to wait for the police to finish their report, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you for your patience." He caught my eye and walked over, crouching in the aisle beside my seat. "Sir, I'm very sorry you were subjected to that. The officers are going to want a statement from you. Would you be willing to speak with them?" I nodded, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "Of course. For what it's worth, she's my HOA president. We've had disputes about neighborhood violations, but I've never threatened her or anyone." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "I figured it was something like that. We see all kinds. The captain and I will be providing statements as well, along with Jessica. What she did, making false accusations and attempting to approach you aggressively, that's a federal offense. The FBI handles those cases." 2 airport police officers boarded and took my statement, along with statements from Marcus, Jessica, the captain, and several passengers who'd witnessed the entire incident. They assured me I'd done nothing wrong and that I was free to continue on my flight. The whole process took about 45 minutes, and we finally pushed back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule. During the flight, I had time to process what had happened. Karen had crossed from being a nuisance into committing what the officers had called a federal offense. Making false accusations against a passenger and creating a disturbance on an aircraft are taken extremely seriously under federal aviation regulations. I knew from my work that the Transportation Security Administration and FBI don't treat these incidents lightly. But more than that, something had crystallized in my mind. Karen's need for control, her weaponization of rules and authority, had finally extended into a domain where I wasn't just another homeowner she could bully. She'd entered my world, and she had no idea how badly she'd miscalculated. After my meeting concluded successfully, I spent the evening making phone calls to contacts I'd developed over 15 years in the aviation industry. I called attorneys who specialized in aviation law. I called FAA officials I'd worked with on safety audits. I called airline executives I'd helped resolve compliance issues. And I called the airport authority director for our local airport, a man named Richard Shin who I'd worked with on 3 separate projects, and who considered me a trusted advisor. Each conversation added another piece to the plan forming in my mind. Karen had used her petty authority to make my life miserable over parking inches and porch light lumens. It was time to show her what real authority looked like. Over the next week, I learned through my contacts that Karen had been charged with interference with the flight crew and making terroristic threats, both federal offenses. She'd been released on bail but was facing serious legal consequences. The airline had also banned her from flying with them pending the outcome of the case. I also learned something interesting from Richard during a lunch meeting. Karen had been a frequent complainer to the airport authority, filing noise complaints about flight paths over our neighborhood at least once a month for the past 3 years. Richard had a thick file of her emails and calls, each one demanding that the airport redirect traffic, threatening lawsuits, and insisting that her property rights were being violated. "She's been a thorn in our side for years," Richard told me over coffee. "But there's nothing we can do. The flight paths are determined by FAA regulations and safety requirements. We can't just change them because one person doesn't like airplane noise." I nodded sympathetically, an idea beginning to take shape. What if there was a way to address her concerns that was completely by the book but also perfectly legal? Richard raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Over the next hour, I outlined my plan. It was audacious, expensive, and absolutely diabolical. Richard's smile grew wider with each detail. "I need to run this by the board, but honestly, this solves several problems for us. Let me make some calls." 3 weeks later, I attended the Airport Authority's public board meeting. The agenda included a presentation on a new noise monitoring and complaint response program. Richard presented the plan, which I'd helped develop, explaining that the authority was taking noise complaints seriously and implementing a comprehensive monitoring system. As part of this program, they'd identified several properties that generated the highest volume of complaints, and were designating them as official noise monitoring stations. These properties would have permanent monitoring equipment installed, and the homeowners would be required to grant aviation easements, meaning they acknowledged and accepted aircraft noise as part of living near an airport. The kicker? Karen's property was identified as the primary monitoring station for our area, given her extensive complaint history. The easement would be permanent, recorded on her property deed, and would actually mandate disclosure to any future buyers that the property was directly under an approach path and subject to aircraft noise. Richard explained that this was all perfectly legal under federal and state aviation law, and that property owners didn't have the right to refuse if their property was selected. The board approved the plan unanimously, pleased to have a solution to their chronic complainer problem. But I wasn't done. Through my attorney, I'd been monitoring Karen's federal case. She'd pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of interfering with a flight crew in exchange for avoiding jail time. Her sentence included probation, a substantial fine, community service, and placement on the federal no-fly list for 5 years. That meant Karen, who'd built her identity partly around her frequent complaints about being an important airline customer, couldn't fly on any commercial aircraft in the United States. She'd have to drive anywhere she wanted to go for the next 5 years. The irony was delicious, but I still had one more move to make. I discovered through public records that Karen's authority, as HOA president, was largely self-appointed. While she'd been elected to the board years ago, she'd maintained control through intimidation and the fact that most homeowners didn't want to deal with the headache of challenging her. Our HOA bylaws, which I read thoroughly for the first time, actually had provisions for removing board members for conduct that brought disrepute to the community. A federal conviction for an offense committed while traveling from the community certainly qualified. I organized a coalition of fed-up homeowners, which wasn't hard given that most people had their own Karen stories. We called a special election meeting, properly noticed according to the bylaws Karen loved to enforce. 43 homeowners showed up, an unprecedented turnout. I presented a motion to remove Karen from the board based on her federal conviction and the negative attention it had brought to Meadowbrook Estates. The vote was 39 in favor, 2 opposed, and 2 abstentions. Karen, who'd shown up expecting to control the meeting as usual, sat in stunned silence as the votes were counted. We then held immediate elections for a new board, and I deliberately didn't run. I wanted nothing to do with the HOA leadership. I just wanted Karen out of power. The new board's first act was to review all outstanding fines and violations from the past 2 years. They discovered that Karen had issued over $12,000 in fines to me alone, most for violations so petty or technical that they bordered on harassment. They voted to refund every penny, along with interest. They also implemented new policies requiring photographic evidence of violations, reasonable notice periods, and an appeals process that didn't involve the person who issued the fine. It was everything the HOA should have been from the start, And it happened because Karen had finally pushed someone who understood how to push back effectively. The real culmination came on a Saturday morning 3 months after her removal from the board. I was in my garage when I heard raised voices from Karen's driveway. I walked out to see Richardson from the airport authority, along with 2 technicians and a surveying crew, standing in Karen's front yard. Karen was in her bathrobe, her hair uncombed, screaming at them to get off her property. Richard was calm and professional, holding a clipboard. Ms. Whitmore, as we discussed in the certified letters you were sent, your property has been designated as a noise monitoring station. We're here to install the equipment today. Karen's face was purple with rage. You cannot do this. This is my property. I'll sue. I'll call my lawyer. I'll call the police. Richard didn't even blink. Ma'am, you're welcome to call anyone you'd like, but we have legal authority under state and federal aviation statutes to install this equipment. The easement has already been recorded on your deed. You can comply voluntarily, or we can proceed with a court order. Either way, the equipment is being installed today. One of the technicians was already unloading a substantial pole from a truck, the kind designed to hold meteorological or monitoring equipment permanently. Karen's eyes darted around wildly, looking for support or escape, and that's when she saw me standing in my driveway, watching the scene unfold. Our eyes met, and I saw the exact moment when everything clicked into place for her. The airport authority's sudden interest in her property. The specific targeting of her home for the monitoring station. The permanent easement that would tank her property value and make it nearly impossible to sell. The federal conviction that cost her the ability to fly. The loss of her HOA position. All of it traced back to that moment on the airplane when she tried to weaponize authority in my domain instead of hers. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her finger rising to point at me accusingly, but no words came out. What could she say? Everything that had happened to her was completely legal, entirely by the book, and a direct consequence of her own actions. She'd filed the noise complaints that made her property the obvious choice for monitoring. She'd created the disturbance on the aircraft that led to federal charges. She'd generated the pattern of harassment that made her removal from the HOA board legally justified. I'd simply helped ensure that the systems she loved to weaponize turned their full attention on her. I gave her a small nod, the kind you'd give any neighbor on a Saturday morning, and walked back into my garage, leaving her standing there in her bathrobe, watching as workers began installing equipment that would permanently mark her property as beneath an airport flight path. Behind me, I could hear Richard continuing his calm, professional explanation of the monitoring program, his voice never wavering despite Karen's increasing hysteria. The sound of drilling started as they began mounting the pole that would be a permanent reminder of her miscalculation. If you enjoyed watching Karen face the consequences of her own petty tyranny, smash that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another story of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Share this with anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA tyrant. Trust me, you'll want to be here for the next one.